Hi, this is my second stream tonight, and this again is a stream using the XSplit software. And what I want to go over in this stream is some ideas about what Bernie could do, okay, if he was elected as the president of the United States. Okay, and by the way, Warren, okay, or Tulsi could do it too, in theory. In any case. But if the person involved, okay, the candidate involved, say Bernie, was not able to get a Democratic Senate on his side, and so still had to fight with a Republican Congress and or perhaps the Republican Supreme Court. Okay, so let's move. I want to share my screen now. And I want to go over an article from Jacobin. It was written by Megan Day. And I'm going to go over that as we go forward. And so, as I said, it deals with the situation where Bernie or someone else that has ideas similar to his have gotten into the White House, don't have the Supreme Court, okay, have a Congress that perhaps is more friendly to them than this one would be, but not so friendly that it's a case where the progressives are in control, okay, of Congress. And the question is raised by Megan Day. In this political environment, what could Sanders do besides fight and lose? Either that, okay, or negotiate and concede, and perhaps inevitably disappoint. And so Megan Day says the president has some powerful tools, specifically the ability to issue executive orders. They can issue hundreds of them for both good and ill. She says there are the soaring heights of Lincoln's famous Emancipation Proclamation, and there's also Trump's recent directive permitting more federal logging on public lands. FDR used 3,522 executive orders to do things like create the Civil Works Administration, which gave jobs to the unemployed, and the Rural Electrification Administration, which brought power to the rural poor. He also used an executive order to initiate the internmentship of Japanese Americans during the Second World War. Now, the problem with executive orders is they can be reversed by the president who comes next. In fact, but they can be reversed by the president who put them forward in the first place, just adding to the article. They can be overturned by the Supreme Court, and in some cases, they can be nullified by new legislation from the Congress. So she says to make lasting change, we can't rely on directives from a single politician. We need a mass movement that can send to Congress the Democratic socialist representatives and the progressives that we need in all states. We need to mount the protests, the strikes, and other disruptive activities that create crises outside of the state to which the officials are forced to respond. She points out to build such a movement is not something separate and apart and exclusive from having aggressive executive action. And she also says if a hypothetical President Sanders were to pass hundreds or even thousands of orders intended to curb the power of capitalists, it would be a major boon to extra parliamentary movements. And she is quite right about that. It's really interesting about that article is that in spite of the limitations, okay, of executive orders, it's possible to put together a list of examples of the kind of measures he could issue if and when he gets into to office. And she offers us a list. She says the list is far from comprehensive, but it demonstrates the power of a single president to intervene and to create new political possibilities, in this case for the many instead of the few. And she puts the measures into categories. The first is climate. And she points out that a president could set extremely aggressive greenhouse gas and energy use reduction goals across the federal government, including the military. Well, the Department of Defense is one of the world's worst one of the world's worst polluters. The president could direct all appropriate executive branch agencies, including the EPA, the Interior Department, and the Army Corps of Engineers, to account for the greenhouse gas impacts of any proposed infrastructure project, and declare that any project with the potential to exacerbate climate change should be rejected, she says. And Bassif Sen, the climate justice project director at the Institute for Policy Studies, says this is going to inevitably lead to litigation. Courts will eventually allow some of these projects to proceed, but he says, correctly, I think, this is a very important delaying tactic, and it creates a roadblock because the industry will have to fight a court battle against the federal government for every piece of harmful infrastructure they try to rebuild. Some of them will be blocked. All of them will be significantly slowed down, sinking capital and making it harder to build new fossil fuel infrastructure, unquote. Also, Megan Day points out Sanders could issue an executive order directing federal agencies to account for environmental justice impacts of all proposed infrastructure projects. And Bassif Sen adds, and then reject the ones which do disproportionate harm to communities of color and the poor. He could also issue an executive order to rejoin the Paris Climate Accord. And again, another quote from Sen, the Paris Agreement is fundamentally flawed. Its goals are not ambitious enough and it is entirely voluntary. But that being said, it is still important for us to be part of the global community of responsible nations and actually engage with this process and contribute in the ways that we can to global climate action, unquote. And day goes on. Okay, President Sanders could establish an interagency task force to lay out the parameters of a Green New Deal. He could also stop all lease sales for coal, oil, and gas extraction for by uranium extraction, mining, and other forms of mining and logging on federal land. Finally, he could bar any company with environmental violations in the last 10 years from securing federal contracts. And she says, taken together, these executive orders would push American climate policy in a dramatically more sustainable direction, making it harder for business to degrade the planet for profit. And then Day moves to the area of foreign policy. And she points out that Sanders could, quoting Phyllis Bennis now, director of the new internationalism project at the Institute for Policy Studies, quote, withdraw troops from countries around the world where they are deployed, including places where they are, quote, carrying out assassinations and other so-called counterterrorism actions which are in violation of international law and which are not keeping us safer and are not keeping people in other countries safer. Sanders could issue an executive order declaring the official termination of the kill list, which is a database of individuals the Pentagon has flagged for capture or murder. He could also end all secret bombing campaigns. Quote, in 2017 alone, there may be as many as 6,000 civilians who have been killed in U.S.-led coalition bombings in Iraq and Syria, says Bennis. It's horrific. Secret bombings are clearly not secret to the people who are being bombed, and yet they occur constantly, wasting money to destroy lives. As Commander-in-Chief, Sanders could end them by unilaterally. President Sanders could issue an executive order reestablishing the legitimacy of the War Powers Resolution, which requires congressional consent to make war. But presidents have been violating this law for decades. They have. The first successful assertion of Congress's power to override executive war making since about 9/11 came last year, when Sanders himself invoked the War Powers Resolution in a bill to end U.S. support for Saudi intervention in Yemen. Sanders could issue an executive order establishing a policy of abjuring any military intervention not authorized by Congress, publicly affirming the anti-war and pro-democratic principles that could motivate his own compliance with the War Powers by resolution. Sanders could also declare that no individual who has worked for a defense contracting company can be appointed to a federal agency. Now, issuing an order like this, quote, would have the effect of redefining publicly what American interests are, unquote, says Bennis. Quote again, do the interests of the Pentagon reflect the interests of corporations or the U.S. people, unquote. While the power of the purse belongs to Congress, Sanders could establish a commission to conduct a top-to-bottom review of the military budget with a view to radically scaling it down. But President Trump recently ordered a task force to identify bloat in the U.S. Postal Service. Why not create one to assess the most frivolous and destructive military the world has ever encountered? Finally, the Pentagon has a program to provide free and low-cost military equipment to U.S. law enforcement agencies. quote, that's how you got an armored personnel carrier in the streets of Ferguson after Mike Brown was killed, says Phyllis Bennis. Quote again, and when they had it, they used it, unquote. President Sanders could issue an executive order discontinuing this program, forestalling efforts to militarize domestic police and make war in American streets. Absolutely, absolutely. So you should be getting the pattern already. There are many, many things a friendly president can do to ease the suffering being caused by Congresses that are too friendly to donors and too hostile to the people. In the criminal justice area, the structure of the criminal justice system poses unique challenges for the executive branch, since most of its activity occurs under state and the local jurisdiction. Still, the president could chip away at the foundation of mass incarceration through certain executive orders and could use others to send a powerful message. Sanders could issue an executive order directing his Department of Justice and the Department of Homeland Security to shutter federal private prisons completely, including immigrant detention centers, and cut all contracts with private prison companies. So just as Trump has ramped up these things, Sanders could quickly ramp them down. Sanders could also issue an executive order directing the Department of Justice to abandon the mandatory minimum sentences in federal prosecution and to pursue non-carceral solutions for low-level offenders. The president also has the power to grant clemency to federal prisoners. He can do this by executive order. President Jimmy Carter pardoned draft dodgers. I don't actually particularly like that term. En masse in the wake of the Vietnam War, and Obama did the same to hundreds of drug offenders in his final days in office. But Obama's commutations were applied selectively to inmates who had completed 10 years of their sentence and who had behaved well in prison. Sanders could finish the job by pardoning every federally incarcerated drug offender sentenced under the draconian requirements of the war on drugs, no matter how much of their sentence they'd served or whether they'd gotten a GED or held a job, criteria that were important to the Obama administration, but that might not be important to an administration that was seriously interested in reforming our criminal justice system and making it more about justice and less about trying to oppress people that the dominant members of our society do not like. Back to the article. Similarly, while presidents can't decide on absolute funding amounts, they can set priorities for how that funding is used within agencies. Here's a quote from Kara Gotch, who's the director of strategic initiatives at the Sentencing Project. Quote, the Department of Justice can say we're not going to spend this $1 billion that would otherwise go to the Drug Enforcement Agency for law enforcement on pursuing and prosecuting drug dealers. Instead, we want that money to be shifted. We want to take $1 billion and invest in an intervention program trying to divert people with substance use disorders into treatment, a community health based approach. There's so much that can be done at the administrative level to reprioritize strategies on how we address crime. Unquote. Sanders could issue an executive order directing all agencies to stop a civil asset of forfeiture, the practice of seizing someone's property merely on the suspicion that they've committed a crime. Obama's Attorney General, Eric Holder, placed limits on the CAF, but they were rolled back. Sanders could declare an immediate end to CAF across agencies, from the DEA and the FBI to the Department of Homeland Security. By executive order, Obama banned the box, quote unquote, meaning the tick box that compels federal employment applicants to disclose their um, uh, uh, criminal records. Trump has not rescinded the order yet, but he's likely to get around to it sometime. If he does, Sanders can reissue the order with an extra provision. Ban the box for federal contractors as well, since they are nearly as many of them as there are direct federal employees. Finally, Sanders could take some risky moves with executive orders, trying to break new ground around criminal justice issues. For example, last year, Bernie Sanders introduced a bill in the Senate to withhold federal anti crime funding from cities that use a cash bail system. While funding is primarily the jurisdiction of Congress, an executive order could be a powerful gesture to legitimate the movement to end cash bail. In 2017, Trump issued a comparable order stripping sanctuary cities of eligibility for federal grants. Though it was swiftly declared unconstitutional by the courts, it had a major impact on the political atmosphere, escalating anti immigrant sentiment and validating the idea that undocumented immigrants endanger our citizens. If Sanders were to try the same tactic for cash bail, it might get struck down, but it would put the injustice of the cash bail system in the national spotlight, strengthening congressional efforts to pass a bill like his No Money Bail Act. Turning to the economy, the United States is full of places that banks have decided it's unprofitable to serve. This forces people to turn to predatory payday lenders and check cashing operations, spending an average of 10% of their income on the exorbitant fees that, quote, alternative, unquote, financial services charge. There's a solution to this problem within our reach. Federal law already requires the U.S. Postal Service to have a brick and mortar office in every zip code, and 60% of them are in zip codes with only one or no bank branches. President Bernie Sanders could issue an executive order directing the post office to begin offering public banking, ensuring that nobody will be kept from traditional financial services, like having checking accounts and saving accounts and being able to get small loans from banks. Besides simply avoiding certain neighborhoods, banks also engage in discriminatory lending. While they're no longer allowed to deny loans to African Americans on racial grounds, for example, they can run complex risk assessment algorithms that perpetuate racial bias and simply hide behind the numbers when the fairness of their lending policies is questioned. Sanders could issue an executive order requiring all financial supervisory agencies to prioritize documenting and combating lending discrimination, not only reaffirming the spirit of the Fair Lending Act, but also leaving a paper trail of disparate outcomes and potential corporate violators of the Act. The Volcker Rule, which prohibits banks from using depositors' money for the kind of risky speculation that led to the 2008 economic collapse, made Wall Street angry. Whoa, too bad. Under Trump, federal bank regulators were put to work rewriting the rule to give banks more leeway. Sanders could issue an executive order instructing all these agencies, the Fed, the SEC, and the FDIC, to leave the Volcker rule intact. And while he's at it, Sanders could issue an order prohibiting Obama style appointments of Wall Street bankers, lawyers, and lobbyists to agencies tasked with overseeing the financial sector. In 2014, Obama issued an executive order setting the minimum wage for federal employees and contractors at $10.10 an hour, $4 less than what analysts at MIT have determined constitutes a living wage. Sanders could issue an executive order correcting the problem, establishing a task force to determine the real living wage across the United States and setting the federal worker minimum accordingly. In that sentence, by day, there's a recognition that the cost of living across the United States is different, in different areas. So a task force would be established to determine the real living wage across the United States, in all the areas of the United States, and setting the federal worker minimum accordingly. Finally, Sanders could issue an executive order establishing new priorities across federal agencies that administer social programs. Last April, Donald Trump issued an order stating, quote, many of the programs designed to help families have instead delayed economic independence, perpetuated poverty, and weakened by family bonds, unquote, and instructing agencies to adhere to what it called, quote, the principles of economic mobility, unquote, strengthening work requirements, reserving benefits only for the poorest, in other words, means testing the benefits, reducing, quote, wasteful spending by consolidating or eliminating federal programs that are duplicative or ineffective, in other words, by implementing austerity, and empowering the private sector to step in and solve problems currently delegated to the federal government. In other words, privatization of federal functions. Sanders could immediately reverse that order and issue one of his own, instructing agencies wherever possible to operate according to, quote, principles of economic equality, unquote, such as universal program design instead of means testing, but decommodification instead of privatization, and redistribution instead of austerity. Canceling student debt. We know Americans hold more than $1.5 trillion in student debt. It keeps tens of millions of people from buying homes and starting families and locks them into jobs they don't want, often more than one at a time, scrambling to make payments before interest gets out of control. What could a President Bernie Sanders do by executive order to address this crisis? For one thing, he could issue an executive order directing his Secretary of Education to erase all debt from the fraudulent for-profit colleges. Okay, not all for profit colleges, but the fraudulent ones. During Obama's tenure, activists pressured his education secretary, Arnie Duncan, to cancel all the federally held debt incurred by students who pursued degrees at fraudulent for profit colleges like Corinthian and ITT. In fact, I wonder whether Trump University fits in here. But anyway, but Duncan demurred. One of the rationales he gave, according to Ann Larson of the Debt Collective, was that the Department of Education didn't have a mandate for such a dramatic move since its leaders are not elected. An executive order from Obama would have undermined that kind of rationale. But there was no executive order from Obama. But that would still be only a drop in the bucket. What about students with degrees from typical nonprofit universities who are struggling to find a foothold due to their student debt burden? In 2015, 70% of college seniors graduated from nonprofit colleges with student debt. Larson says the president could do something about that too. Quote, when Congress was given the power to issue and collect student loans in 1958, the Department of Education also received a power from Congress called, quote, compromise and settlement, unquote, which allows them to waive the right, to collect on them. And then the Higher Education Act of 1965 solidified that power in the hands of the Secretary of Education. So these are old laws going back to 1958 and 1965. So Sanders could issue an executive order directing his Secretary of Education to immediately write off all student loan debt for which the federal government is the creditor, which is the majority of student loan debt in the United States. The executive order could also direct the Department of Education to assume all the debt of borrowers who owe money to private lenders and write that off too, reducing American student loan burden from 1.5 trillion to zero. So, the point is, congressional action is not necessary to reduce student loan burden from 1.5 trillion to zero. Sanders can do it himself if he is the president of the United States. That alone may be reason enough to make him the president of the United States. And remember, Warren doesn't want to reduce all student loan debt to zero. She wants to put some income limitations on that. Family income, types, of limitations, not the income of the debtors who have burdens themselves, as individuals. Sometimes people who've gone through schools are not on good terms with their parents and don't have any family money from them. They come out of school with the same debts, as other students. It's only fair that their debts should be canceled too. So anyway, Day's article goes on and says that as economists estimate, some economists estimate, the immediate cancellation of all student debt would deliver a major windfall to the American economy, reducing unemployment by roughly 0.3% and boosting GDP by almost $1 trillion over the next decade. That is the finding of a study that was done at the Levy Institute by Scott Fulwiler, Stephanie Kelton, Marshall Steinbaum, and I forget who the fourth author was. Could have been actually Pavlina Pachernyeva. Anyway, there's a link to the report, okay, at the Levy Institute here on the impact of the cancellation of the student debt. And we got to keep in mind Sanders can do that by himself. There's yet another executive order that could have an amazing effect on things as well. If Sanders was fighting a Republican Senate, okay, or a Republican House, or even a Republican Congress, then it is almost a certainty that when debt limits were approached, that the Congress, or such a Congress, would block by raising the debt limit and try to use that as a negotiating tactic against the president, okay, and against the Democrats in Congress to try to cut spending for programs which the Democrats favor but the Republicans hate. And every year or two, we would have another hostage taking, a hostage taking by the Republicans holding federal workers hostage and the economy hostage so they could get tax cuts for their people and cut spending for most of the people. We saw that all throughout the period when the Republicans had control of the House and then control of the House and the Senate from 2011 actually right up to the present. The debt ceiling law can be made a dead letter by a Democratic president, by Bernie Sanders, who was determined to do that. What the president would have to do would be to order the Secretary of the Treasury to mint a 1 ounce platinum coin with a face value of, say, $100 trillion. Now, that $100 trillion could not be spent by the executive branch, except for spending already appropriated by the Congress, and except for spending to repay the national debt as it falls due. But in those two areas, the Republicans would not be able to do any hostage taking. All the hostage taking would be restricted to appropriation bills, and they would have to vote up or down for the provisions that they failed to put in the appropriations bills. In other words, if they determined to cut Social Security in various ways, or Medicare, okay, in various ways, they would have to take responsibility for those cuts. They would not have a situation where the Democrats would have to join them in those cuts, because if they didn't, then it would be possible to place blame on both the Democrats and the Republicans for allowing a shutdown of the government. So an executive order by the president to mint $1 trillion coin would stop that kind of hostage taking from going on and would change the political situation materially when there was a Democratic president that was operating with a hostile Congress. Day goes on. Democratic socialists have a far reaching program for political change that needs to be measured in decades, not in years. We can't expect this change to happen overnight, nor for it to be enacted by a single politician. As Eugene Debs said, quote, I would not lead you into this promised land if I could, because if I could lead you in, someone else would lead you out, unquote. But much can be done in the present, both to ameliorate suffering and pave the way for future transformations. We know that reactionary measures from the top can sow division and resignation among working people and present formidable material obstacles to resistance. By the same token, bold action by progressives from the top can foster the emergence of socialism from below. As long as it is undertaken in the spirit of a slogan Sanders used during his 2016 campaign, and I might add a slogan he always uses now as well, quote, not me, but us, unquote. So, Bernie can do a lot from the top, even if it seems to be a possibility that the Republicans retain control of the Senate. I think the odds are severely against them now of regaining control in the House. So they won't be able to hold the administration hostage any longer through the House. But they might be able to do it if we have a situation where we have a Mitch McConnell as the majority leader of the Senate. But the executive orders the president can issue and the other tools at the command of the president can make things very hot for a leader of the Senate who is unwilling to cooperate with the president and can prepare the way for a new majority in the Senate in 2023 if there is not already a new majority in 2021. So even if we think that it's not likely that the Democrats can take the Senate at this time, and personally I think they have a very good chance to do so, it still would be worthwhile to do everything we can to elect Sanders or someone equally as good in 2020, get them in office, and get a House of Representatives that is favorable to them and that will support them in office. Okay. Even if we're a few votes short in the Senate, or even if Sanders is a few votes short in the Senate, it will still be possible to make big changes in the current situation and to greatly improve our political situation on a day-to-day basis and our foreign policy. We cannot lose sight of that. We have to work hard to make it happen. It's very, very important. If we had such a situation and we had to get Republican support for certain key legislation, let's say, for example, Medicare for All legislation, and the Republicans stood fast and would not vote for it, we might still be able to use the purge tactics that I spoke of in connection with the NRA, the short stream I did this evening on the NRA. We might be able to use purge tactics here too to vote out of office anyone, whether Republican or Democrat, who took money from the health insurance industry or the pharmaceutical companies or other healthcare institutions that were blocking the people's will when it came to Medicare for All. I want to make one final comment about the Green New Deal. Okay, in this respect, it's imperative that we have a President Sanders or someone like him in 2000, okay, in 21, and also to have a friendly Congress in both houses of Congress. If we have that, we can move the Green Deal forward very, very rapidly in 2000, okay, and 21. And it's very important to have that because every year that passes, the more grave the climate situation gets. But if we can't do this by 2021, it is very likely that gaining control by 2023 will still not be too late. We can prepare the way for acting fast if we have Sanders as president in 2021, and we have a friendly House of Representatives as well. That combination can do a lot to prepare the way for the emergency action we need, beginning with the start of 2023. So even if we don't win the Senate in 2021, all is not lost. All is likely not to have been lost. We can still gain a lot, even not having control of the Senate. If we get the House elected with more progressives in it, and we get Bernie Sanders in the catbird seat, that is very, very important. All kinds of pressure can be placed on the Republican majority in the House during that 2-year period to get certain bills through and to create such heavy pressure on them with respect to other bills through that they will be greatly weakened in the fight for control in 2022. So, that was my presentation for tonight. I hope to get time to go over some other things. But at this point, let me see your comments. Okay, and by the way, tell me if I remain on camera. Okay, I should still remain on camera, but I'm going to shift over to Facebook now. You should see my Facebook page on here now. Here we go. My Facebook page is still showing the earlier video. Okay, so please share this, okay, as much as you can. I'm going to call this stream the impact impact. Oops, sorry. Running presidency, even without full control of Congress. And the link the article I discussed tonight was from Jacobin. And there it is. Okay, as time goes on, I will learn to put those things on my stream. Okay, it's just a matter of time now. Okay, I trust that my sound has been pretty good for this one. I shouldn't have had any trouble. If you'll comment on this for me and let me know, okay, I'll be very grateful. Okay, Bonnie says my sound is good, so that's good. Okay, I don't have too many comments from you yet, I don't believe. But maybe I do. I'm not seeing. Okay, let me go to the page itself. I'll mute. Okay, I'm going to mute my microphone here so there's no echo. Uh, you should not have an echo now. Russell has to call it a night. Hey, Russ. Nice to see you. Hi, Randy. How you doing? Trump has opened the door to extreme executive orders. The sky is the limit. That's true, everybody. The sky is the limit. Okay, if you could all share this for me as much as you can, that would be very good. So far, I've got only 2 shares. I thought this was a pretty good stream, so see if you can get the shares out there for me. I'll see if I can get the shares as well. This one should be on YouTube, but very, very quickly. Oh, there I'm getting. Okay, I'm getting the echo effect in the stream, so I'm going to go back to the other page. Okay. So, okay, here I am again. Before I say goodbye, okay, I would like you to take a look at this. So please do that for me, okay, if you would. So Bonnie tells me it's hard to see the blue and the green, but I'll check that out, okay, for myself if I can in just a few minutes and make uh, some necessary adjustments. I'll take one more look to see if there are further comments. And if there are no further comments, I'll say goodnight. Okay, anyway, thanks everybody for coming. And I'll be back tomorrow night, most probably at 9 o'clock or so. So I will see you then. And thanks for coming.